small spurts of stuff is still good training. A lot of people feel like they need to have this 2-hour block to go to the gym. But like I came home from my drive and I went in my garage and I did 3 exercises for my shoulder. That was like all I did. The frequency and the regularity of the loading is really better than having really big, long sessions anyways. I talk to a lot of people that have a big climbing session and then I do my strength training after. But it probably makes more sense to have a session where you're having better quality with the training stuff. And it doesn't need to be a lot.
Welcome to the Testpiece podcast. This podcast is about all things high-level climbing. How to go from good to great. I'm your host, Joshua Horsley. I've been climbing for over 30 years. We recently updated our Patreon, and now you get exclusive content from the guests that you love. You get your episodes before everyone else, and they're ad-free. Try it out now at patreon.com/testpiece with a free 7-day trial. Okay, let's start the show. Tyler Nelson, Camp4 Human Performance. Welcome back to the podcast. How are you doing?
Doing great. Thank you.
As I rolled into this, and we were talking about kids and crying, I said that I have dislocated my shoulder before, and this podcast is going to focus on, what'd you write? You wrote scapular function in overhead athletes. And I was just like, shoulders. You're talking about shoulders as a layman. And so this topic is near and dear to my heart because I've had lots of issues with my shoulders, but mainly my right one, which I dislocated while climbing in 2008, pretty severely too, and took me out for 6 to 9 months, I think. And after that, I had over a decade, maybe 15 years almost of repeated dislocations, a lot of like 2 steps forward, 2 steps back, to be honest, where I'd be feeling strong, tweak it, doing something dumb, and taking another 3 months to come back. I've probably spent tens of thousands of dollars on specialists, orthos, PRP, everything you can imagine. And so, yeah, how's that for a epic start? Was that a tearjerker, Tyler? Did you have surgery at all? No surgery? What was the MRI look like originally? So the MRI that I did was not a contrast MRI, and it looked okay. And I didn't have surgery until 2021, so about 13 years later. And when I finally got an MRI with contrast, because of the repeated dislocations, and I remember having someone just say to me, like, if you just have a labrum that's just torn to shreds, like, you can do all the strengthening you want, it's going to help, but you should consider surgery. And so, yeah, I got surgery in 2021. And it's been quite a bit better since then. But every time I climb, I do prehab. On most rest days, I do prehab. It's a way of life for me, is, dealing with shoulder stability and trying to reduce the future of injury. And so when I think about a podcast like this with you, I just think if we can help one person avoid a serious shoulder injury or give one person hope that they can figure out their way through that injury, that's a huge win.
Yeah, of course. And how was the dislocation? Was it like in a dihedral or did you fall?
I was in a gym and I went into a pretty extreme gas stone that was actually below me and shouldered into it. And so it dislocated forward. And interestingly enough, I was like a gymnastics coach, or no, what do you call it? We had like a gymnastics club in my college. This was in college. And we had a little gymnastics club, and I had seen someone dislocate their shoulder just maybe a couple weeks prior on the rings, took them to the ER, watched them reduce it. And I realized that I wanted to get my shoulder back in as soon as possible. And I just stood there and I put my arm over my head, and it didn't work. And then I kind of stood up and I did kind of like a 90-90 with a little extra rotation. I should make this a disclaimer. This is not the way to reduce a dislocation by yourself, but I didn't know any better. And then it popped back in, and then I didn't really raise my arm over my head for quite a while.
So why was there no contrast then on the original MRI? That could have saved you a lot of headache for a decade.
Good question, Tyler. I couldn't tell you. I was, a 20-year-old kid went to the ER, or no, I didn't even go to the ER that night, but then did see a specialist. And actually something that really bothers me is that over the decade plus, no one ever said to me, hey, maybe you should take a closer look and see if surgery is right for you. I kind of was of the belief that surgery is rarely recommended and you can fix yourself just with muscles and, mobility and all this stuff. And then somewhere along the way, one of my chiros was like, we can do a lot here, but in some cases surgery is good. And that was actually something I was going to bring up later to you, Tyler, was this question around when you might consider surgery, but I don't know. I feel like we're jumping the gun.
I mean, I don't think so. I think you're a really good example of someone that would respond well. And even in labral tears, most labral tears don't need surgical interventions, but ones that have persistent pain and persistent instability like yours did, then that's absolutely an option. I think people are too on one end of the spectrum of like never get surgery or you have to get surgery. And obviously the reality is the answer is somewhere in the middle, but it really is so dependent on the individual. Like I've dislocated my shoulder when I was in high school wrestling and it was relocated immediately after, but my genetics are and this is important for like our conversation today, is like, I definitely have a unique scapular position in my body type, which is pretty normal in just the general population, just variations in the scapula, but I also am really tight. So my ligaments and joints are really tight. So my range of motion has never been great, but the good side of that is my joint has lots of stability. And I even dislocated my shoulder and I've never had shoulder pain. And I'm 44. Wow. And I've tried really hard and tried to climb big walls and done all the things and strength train but my risk is different than your risk, not necessarily because I do something that's so much different than you or so much better than you. It's really just like there's a lot of variables that are really hard to consider. And so, making sure that people get the right imaging is a really important thing. And it's not always indicated, but in that case, like yours was definitely, arthrogram mandatory.
Yeah. Really wish I had done that early on. And I just want to point out, I love that you said that it's somewhere in the middle, oftentimes where it's surgery or not surgery. And the person that you're talking to, I often think of chiropractors or PTs. I think of them more highly if they're willing to say, hey, like, let's go get imaging, and who knows, maybe surgery would be helpful for you. Just like if you go to a surgeon, if they're like, look, let's really go the route of PT. Like I will cut you open if you need me to, but that's not my go-to. And just, you always think that these people have biases often where like a surgeon wants to do surgery, but that's not the case in a good surgeon or a good chiropractor or physical therapist. You want to work with someone that is not too dogmatic either way.
Yeah, if someone has all the answers and they know exactly what you need, that's kind of a red flag, because when we dive into talking about the shoulder and the scapula in particular, there's so many variables that we don't understand. And there's so many examples of people that have this, thing that we call scapular dyskinesis that have no pain, that are fully functional, but they have this thing. And then there's also people that have it and they do have pain. And so it's like really complicated to know exactly the mechanisms that are helping people, but exploring options and, essentially shared decision-making between a healthcare provider and the individual is like, my job is giving people lots of options and having a good understanding of research and, the potential outcomes, and let us kind of help guide what makes the most sense for that individual, track their symptoms and their progression, and then modify it based on how they respond.
Something that you kind of slipped in there, but I don't know if people caught, is that you are guiding individuals, hopefully alongside a surgeon, this like shared responsibilities for people who look at the different imaging or work with them with hands-on or see how they progress. But fundamentally, each patient should make their own decision. And I think that sometimes people take their health or their injuries and they go to the doc and it's just like, doc says I should do this. And you go, okay, but I encourage people to see multiple doctors, go different routes, and then recognize that it's their body. At the end of the day, people like you or surgeons are just guides to help them and share their knowledge. But feel like it's important to kind of take control of your own injury and decide you're going to get healthy and figure out your way forward and use the people you can to help get you there. But you don't want to absolve yourself of that responsibility.
Yeah, self-efficacy is such a big deal in rehabilitation. Like every healthcare provider has a bias. If someone goes to manual therapy school, they are very biased towards some sort of manual therapy intervention. A strength conditioning coach that has someone with a sore shoulder, they're very biased towards thinking it's a strength problem. If we go to a chiropractor, they have different mechanisms, right? All these things. My bias is largely strength conditioning as well. I like strength training. I think there's long-term benefits aside from just managing pain with strength training, et cetera. But the reality is when we look at shoulder pain complaints and we look at different groups of people that get different interventions, people get better in pain and function without getting stronger. And so it's like, we can't just blanket statement say, hey, you have a pain complaint. We need to strengthen your shoulder and we need to get you stronger to get better, because the evidence does not support that. Right. And so that's a good example of like, hey, this is what I would recommend doing, but these are the reasons why. But it's not really that you have to get stronger to get better, because most of my population, which is all climbers, they're really strong. Right. It's always some form of overload issue. Like I can honestly say I've really never met a not strong climber. Right. It's just like climbers are inherently strong. There's a lot of variation in where that strength comes from, et cetera. But like it's not that simple. Right. And if someone likes to do strength training and they're very comfortable going to the gym, they're probably someone that would respond well to that. But if they're not used to that habit and they're just used to going and climbing and doing Pilates and yoga, then we would probably do something a little different, because I can't take my bias and say, oh, this is definitely going to work, because, that doesn't really make sense.
Well, let's get into some of the basic shoulder mechanics and just help me understand this extremely complex joint. And, you talked about how you were generally tighter and I may be generally looser. And I feel like both of those are really important when we talk about the shoulder joint, because it's so complex, because it can do so much. And then because we also demand a lot of it as climbers. Like, how do shoulders work?
Yeah. So, essentially it's a ball and socket kind of joint. Priority is range of motion, right? So the shoulder joint has a lot of range of motion, but the way that the arm bone sits in the socket, the arm bone is larger than the socket. A lot of times people will use like a golf ball sitting on a tee analogy. And so when you bring up the labrum and you having, a labral tear, and you probably maybe had a Bankart lesion or whatnot with your dislocation.
Correct.
Like the labrum is responsible for keeping the ball close to the socket. So it kind of deepens the socket. So the rotator cuff muscles, which are really close to the joint, they're not prime movers, but they definitely control the stability of the ball being close to the socket. So when you have a pathology like yours that's kind of advanced, it's really hard to get that mechanism to function properly, to stay really close to the joint. And so you have excess, motion in the joint.
Well, what I found was that when things stayed in the right place, shoulder felt great. I'd have no shoulder pain. It was when things didn't stay in the right place that it would be devastating. Okay. I feel like sometimes when people think about shoulders and they hear that golf ball and the tee analogy, it makes it a little myopic, and you think of like literally right there, the shoulder being the arm bone, and I don't know what the thing that's coming up to it, like the collarbones, I guess. But I know that there's a lot more that influences the shoulder. There's the trapezius, all the rhomboids. Like, can you also kind of maybe show us how everything around it affects the shoulder mechanics, and make sure we don't just kind of think about it as just this little tiny area?
Yeah. So there's 13 muscles that attach to the scapula. And so the scapula is essentially the shoulder blade, right? And the shoulder blade kind of wraps around the corner, and then it has a joint with the long collarbone, right? The clavicle. So then there's an AC joint. And so if you can imagine, there's like kind of a horseshoe on the tip of the shoulder. But then underneath that, on the scapula, there's the 4 primary rotator cuff muscles. And the rotator cuff muscles are really quite short, and they attach right across the joint to the ball portion of the arm. And so their ability to produce a lot of primary motion, their torque angle is not very good. So they're not really prime movers, where the larger muscle on the tip of the shoulder, the deltoid, is a prime mover of the shoulder. If we're doing squeezing movements, the pec becomes a primary mover. If we're pulling posteriorly or backwards, the lat becomes a prime mover. So these larger global muscles are responsible for the big working portions of the rotator cuff and the shoulder, but the rotator cuff is all the fine tuning. When the arm gets in different positions, the rotator cuff has a job of isometrically, controlling and contracting and releasing to fine tune all the weird movements that we do as climbers. And that's why, having rotator cuff related shoulder pain and having rotator cuff tears in climbers is, in overhead athletes in general, is really common. It's just a very exposing activity for the rotator cuff, which has pretty bad leverage.
So does the rotator cuff and those stabilizing muscles, does that mean that they just try to help the humeral head sit where it's supposed to be so that those big prime movers can exert their force, like in the best way? Is that how I should think about it? Okay.
Yeah.
And you said that you see a lot of climbers with, or any kind of overhead athletes with oftentimes rotator cuff injuries. What are the most common injuries that you see in climbers related to shoulders? Is it really focused on rotator cuff? Do you see a lot of labral tears and Bankart lesions like I had?
The Bankart lesions are usually associated with a trauma, so those aren't as common as having slap tears, which are quite common in climbers. And there's some papers that have been done, one in particular where they did an MRI on, I think, 50 climbers. They measured both shoulders, and these were asymptomatic climbers that had been climbing, and they had labral tears, they had rotator cuff tears, they had tendonitis of the bicep tendon, they had some cartilage degeneration on the inside of the joint. So they found all these structural things, but the important caveat there is those individuals all had normal function, they had a normal orthopedic exam, they had normal strength, and they didn't have pain. And so one of the important things when we talk about imaging is, like, imaging can give us a diagnosis, but in your case, imaging makes sense with an arthrogram for just a regular athlete that, has an overload kind of shoulder pain and they come into chat with me or whatnot. They don't need imaging right away. And the imaging concern there is the language that's used from the healthcare provider, either myself or a radiologist or a medical doctor, and how they describe what that means. Because those things are common in people with no pain, we can't really say that if we find one of those things, that's the reason why they hurt, or those things are expected to change, because the science would say that's not very accurate.
I've read a lot of MRIs on myself, and they always make me cringe because the language can be so disturbing and scary, even though it may not be related to the pain I'm having. And I remember before getting surgery, my mom's actually a physician, and she said, Josh, go for it. You've had a decade plus of all this stuff. But her warning was, this may not fix your pain or your problem. Just so you know, like, there's no guarantees here. This is a route that you can take, but you never know. And I have some issues with my wrist. I don't want to get into it. But I got an MRI and it was not so great. But what made me wish I had done is I wish I had gotten an MRI of my other wrist also, because I wouldn't be surprised if it looks exactly the same and it's not totally clear if that MRI, again, it's like, you don't know if that imaging tells the whole story. It just tells a story. It doesn't mean that you're symptomatic because of what you pick up in there. And so always good to remember.
Yeah. I was telling someone this morning, talking about, finger injury and having a big swollen middle knuckle. Everyone that comes into my office, we scan their finger, but I always scan the other finger too. And it's almost always looks very similar, right? With the exception of like an acute trauma, pulley rupture, et cetera. But if it's joint stuff, joint hypertrophy, capsulitis, having bony growths within stressed tendons, that's all pretty common to happen on the other side. And so it can be helpful in that setting for someone to visualize that and be like, oh, that makes me less scared as a patient to know that my other finger also looks like that and it doesn't have pain, instead of seeing one finger and being like, oh yeah, that looks really bad. Like, what am I going to do about it? What can the individual learn to do about it? But another example, like, I get people, it's not the same joint, of course, and the hip is much more stable, but my MRI is, if someone read that, they would be like, how are you walking? Like, I have 3 labral tears in my hip. I have a ligamentum teres tear, which is the ligament inside the hip, and I have some glute med, tears, tendinosis. And those have been there probably for 10, 15 years, as far as I know, and the reality is my hip doesn't hurt. Like, I've had a history of back pain in my life, and I have a pathology in my hip, like I have cam impingement, but still, like, if you looked at that picture, you'd be like, oh my God, like you probably shouldn't be doing anything on your hip, right? And I know what my limitations are and what maybe doesn't make sense from a long history, but like the imaging doesn't tell the whole story.
This is one of the reasons why I do have some bias towards strength and conditioning, is that if you just sit around and hope to heal, like, I don't know, it doesn't quite work. But if you keep moving forward and exercise, like somehow the body finds a way. And I used to be bummed that maybe I, had this issue with my shoulder, and I assumed that all the top athletes just moved perfectly and everything about them was great. And someone said to me that the best athletes are the best compensators. This idea that like you don't have to have everything perfect. Like, and so again, moving forward, getting exercise, working on figuring out how to move forward, even if you have an injury, I always think is like the way to go, because if you sit around and hope that your body's going to adapt, it won't. But if you force your body to adapt, it seems to work out better.
Oh yeah. I love that. And I think that really ties in nicely with not expecting things to be perfect. And when we talk about the shoulder and when we talk about the scapula, there's, it's been maybe 15, 20 years now, where 15, 20 years ago, the scapula having a perfect rhythm, which is how it moves in relation to the arm, and a static position was a real important, let's say, top priority for healthcare providers, because there was so many assumptions made that if it didn't move in the right rhythm, that you would get more types of shoulder pain. In particular, this one was like an impingement syndrome, which is kind of an outdated diagnosis now, but there was so much emphasis on people having this perfect posture. But one of the most interesting modern ways of thinking about it is people's scapulas move in relation to keep the length tension relationship optimized with the rotator cuff. And so if we think about climbers have this weird kind of rolled shoulder posture, like why is that? And it's probably obviously a lot of the movements that we do on the climbing wall, but it adapts. The scapula is amazing at adapting to make the length tension relationship better for the rotator cuff, which is actually a protective thing. And so it's like, we can also consider kind of these modifications as helping athletes do what they do, which is a lot of rock climbing, and reduce the injury risk of the rotator cuff.
Gymnasts also seem to exhibit a touch of a rounded shoulder position, and they are strong. Their shoulders they do just fine. So let's learn more about scapula and how it moves. But I just want to tie that to, you're seeing a lot of rotator cuff injuries. Just what are we as climbers seeing the most injuries in? And then, let's tie that into the scapula and why we might be seeing those injuries in climbers.
It's hard to know exactly what the number one, I think, shoulder pain, I think more generally is number two in the climbing demographic. Finger injuries are number one. But the actual order of most common injuries, I'm not sure off the top of my head. I don't know if Volker's reported on those numbers, but definitely rotator cuff tears. And now a lot of the language is around for clients using different language, because tear sounds scary, right? Rotator cuff tear sounds scary. Impingement, external impingement sounds scary. And so if someone has pain when they're reaching over their head, and me as a healthcare provider says, oh, you probably have a rotator cuff tear, or we do an ultrasound and say, oh, you have a small supraspinatus tear. Tear sounds scary. And so now the language in the general rehabilitative research has suggested we use different terminology, like rotator cuff related shoulder pain or subacromial pain syndrome, which is more of like a anatomic descriptor, but it doesn't, for the individual, invoke a lot of fear and negativity. So those two are definitely on there. And then having some sort of irritation in the bicep tendon, which goes up on the front side of the shoulder and attaches to the labrum. So a slap tear or, bicep tendinosis would also be like high on the, diagnosis list of a climber.
Yeah, I've definitely heard and seen all those. That language usage is interesting. I've gone the other way, where when someone tells me, oh, I kind of tweaked a finger, or I kind of tweaked something, or they're like, oh, I have a sprained ankle. And I'm always just like, yes, you should keep on doing your sport or whatever you need to do. If it's not super bad, that puts you on the bench, but just know that means things have torn a bit. Like you're not as, like when they say sprain or tweak, I don't know if they always recognize that that means that you're at risk for a further injury because you've literally damaged the structure. And I don't know, I guess I'm on like other end of the spectrum where I want to be like honest. I want to know like this shit's torn. Be careful, you know?
Yeah. I mean, and that's a personality thing too, right? Where like I would say most of my clientele, I could probably communicate bluntly with them about that, but other demographics of clients that would not work very well too. So maybe reading the room there with an individual makes sense. But ultimately, does it really change what we do as a healthcare provider? Does it change if I know there's a rotator cuff tear or I suspect there's rotator cuff tear? If there wasn't a large acute moment where there was an audible pop and they can't physically hold their arm up and there's a ton of fear and stress, yeah, sure, that makes sense. But for most people that walk through the door or I talk to like via remotely, like it doesn't really change a ton. It's more important for me to understand what movements are provocative, what are they fearful of, what are they trying to get back to doing? And in my case, it's they want to get back to rock climbing with no pain. You know, what are their normal loading habits? What do they understand? What are they fearful of? All those things like really matter to say, okay, cool, well, let's create a plan for you that makes sense for your schedule, for the equipment you have. And then we just need to start working and tracking things and staying in communication and then modify those things as they adapt, right? So it's a constantly moving target, and that definitely works well.
And so to link this into some of the things you're talking about with the scapula and this idea that we thought that needed to have this perfect rhythm or movement, does that mean that you do not worry so much about how that person's scapula moves and you're not so worried about reprogramming them?
If we look at the modern research and, you know, the last decade, even 2 decades, like the tide has changed. Like there was a really large emphasis on looking at scapular motion and identifying dyskinesis as a predictive model for future shoulder injuries. Now the researcher would say that's not very accurate. If we look at someone and it's very objectively like they have a winged scapula, very objectively like you who is not a healthcare provider be like, that scapula looks weird when they move their arm. That is considered, you know, a true scapular dyskinesis. But again, if we look at the general public and athletes, like 30% general public, 6% athletes have dyskinesis on their dominant arm. And even if those people have pain and the pain goes away, they still have the thing. And so it's not really that the thing's not important at all. It's really that only putting an emphasis on that thing kind of misses the point of why we're doing the things that we're doing, because the reality is when they measure like a motor control group that has no load focusing on cueing and another group that does like scapular exercise with load, like they both get better. But essentially what we're doing with the scapular exercises is it's a really good rotator cuff exercise. So if we think like the IYT, in particular, the Y from a standing position with the thumbs up, that's a really good rotator cuff exercise. So instead of like healthcare providers just like drilling down on, oh, your scapula has dyskinesis, oh, it's not moving in a good rhythm, that kind of language just makes people feel like there's something wrong with their body instead of just saying, oh, there's, you know, some sort of shoulder pain. We're going to build capacity based on what it is that you're interested in doing. And then we apply movements to them. And most of those people will get better. But adding in a lot of the emphasis, I think now is kind of considered maybe not necessary.
Yeah, I ran into this when I was dealing with all of my shoulder issues. And when I say dealing with it, I mean, literally over a decade, I learned about really keeping your shoulder down, really like making sure you don't shrug up. So I did a lot of those exercises. And if you looked at how I did my pull-ups, I was always just obsessed with like really pulling my shoulder down and back, like really packed and low. And actually, I would argue that that was important for me because I was so unstable that like if I had my shoulder come up and do something weird, I would dislocate or lead to extreme pain. But I was in this weird category where I probably didn't have a labrum that was helping keep it in there. And so I just thought, wow, it's always all about being able to pull your scapula down and back. And then I bump into a friend of mine who had unbelievably good one arm strength. He could literally climb a rope with one arm. So do like dynamic one arm pull-ups. And I had another friend who was also really good at one arms, and they had these massive upper traps. And when I watched them climb and do their pull-ups, I'm not saying that they were shrugging up or anything, just there wasn't this overemphasis on what I was trying to do, which was just really control my scapula down. I just always like surprised me. I thought I knew how it worked. I really needed my scapula to pull down. And again, not saying that they were shrugging up, but there was clearly more going on than just some kind of like forcibly down thing and locking in place. And that kind of like messed with my head and on how it all works.
I would say probably the majority of my clients that I communicate with that have shoulder pain and they're, it's maybe post-surgical labral tears, or they heard a pop, or they're very fearful of loading, or we're introducing load. Shoulder shrugs is like one of the first exercises I'll give them to do.
Fascinating. So what's funny is now in my rehab after doing shoulder surgery, I have had to relearn kind of like shrugging and, putting my arm over, doing all the things that I avoided. And I've been doing a lot of dumbbell presses, all this stuff that I used to avoid. I used to always try to keep my scapula down and back. And now I'm just kind of letting it do what it does when I go overhead in a controlled manner with safe weights. And my shoulder has never felt more stable. It messed with my head. I thought, here I've avoided this for so long, shrugging, always trying to force my scapula into this quote unquote stable position. And it wasn't that simple.
Yeah, I've never been a really big fan of healthcare providers or coaches that kind of have this narrative of these exercises are better for climbers and these exercises are not as good for climbers just based on what climbing looks like. I think that always misses the point of just being comprehensive and being able to tolerate movements in all directions and easy ways to build muscular capacity and build rate of force development. And, there's reasons that we want to be very intentional with positions in some contexts, but just basic strength training is amazing how it really will just build a more robust athlete that can tolerate more of the sport. And so understanding from a healthcare provider standpoint, when you started loading, absolutely those things are fearful. We want to be thoughtful about exposing your shoulder to the things that you're fearful of. But I tell all my clients, there's no way to know when you're ready for that. I don't know. You don't know. Your surgeon doesn't know until we actually try it. And so, starting with something that's very palatable and safe for them. And then when they feel ready, that's when we want to do it, right? And then we want to try it, and then we want to give them some exposure, and then we can lean into more exposure and, progress in the difficulty of the exercise, et cetera. But again, that's still like some form of shared decision-making based on someone's response, not me having a template of, hey, we have 6 weeks and we're going to do this at week 2. Oh shit, you're behind. Like, it doesn't really work that way.
So something I want to pick on for the nuance to help me understand it better is when I hear this concept of there's not really such a thing as scapular dyskinesis or, in general, I'm sure that there are a certain population of people who are actually really messed up. Like that term comes from really people who have extremely bad scapular function. But that's probably not what's going on with me or the average athlete. I also assume that doesn't mean that's just a license to just do whatever you want and every movement is good and there's no kind of general guidelines. So, when we think about things that are extreme ranges of motion, I think of like gasto clings or these things. I know that it's not saying that we can't do those, but what's the balance here between saying, hey, your scapula may move differently than most, as long as you're asymptomatic, that's fine. And then understanding what kind of cueing and the way to think about movement that helps us in those situations that are kind of inherently risky.
I think just basic coaching with strength training stuff is really enough in most cases, where if we think about like the fingers, there's not much coaching. There's never been much coaching about how to actually do a block lift. Like, how do you get into a half crimp position and hold that position? And as a consequence of that, people just focus so much on the load. And it's like, I'm just going to do as much load as I can, right? And watching people do block lifts on the internet, you're like, from my perspective, like those are loads that aren't really satisfying the coordination function, and they're risky because they're heavy. The same thing would apply to the shoulder, right? And so we like muscle isolation, like you can't isolate just the scapular muscle. It just doesn't make any sense. There's way too many muscles, right? So you can't isolate the scapula without loading the rotator cuff, right? And so if we think about just like ways to load the rotator cuff, which are pretty common, and people do those, like external rotation from your arm at your side, external rotation with your arm at 90-90. Doing scapular pull-ups, I think, is totally fine. But if people don't really focus on like the quality of the movement kind of self-corrects with the scapula. Anything you do with the shoulder, pushing, pulling, lifting, etc., if the movement quality is high, the scapula is always along for the ride. So is the rotator cuff. And certainly certain exercises will be more precise at loading than others. But like I'm a big fan of being very general with people's strength training. Like do maybe 6 movements total, and that's it. And that's all you need to do. And then there's a reason to modify all those, but mostly it's just when people get bored, but there's a whole bunch of different options out there, but people don't just want to pile on all the things thinking that everything is helpful, nothing is risky. That kind of misses the whole, envelope of function discussion.
Gosh, load management is something that I feel like I relearn all the time, where when I started doing more of these shrugs and overhead pressing, that's not like I haven't done it before. And just for reference, I can military press with a bar over 100 pounds, but when I'm doing these more focused one-arm dumbbell lifts that I'm trying not to do something weird and kind of wiggle around my shoulder. Yeah, I'm using like 10-pound dumbbell, 15-pound dumbbell. I do a lot of raises with a 5-pound dumbbell. And let me then ask, like, what do you mean by quality of movement? Because to me, like, yeah, again, I can take probably a 40 or 50-pound dumbbell and lift it overhead, but I wasn't quite getting what I needed out of it unless I was a 10-pound dumbbell and I was kind of allowing myself to let the shoulder come up versus, it's hard to describe what I would do, but really I feel it almost in my ribs. Do you know what I mean by that? Like, keeping my shoulder down, which didn't quite satisfy what I was looking to do when going overhead with weights.
Yeah. And like setting the rib cage is an okay cue for athletes, because we always want to cue pull down and back with your shoulder blade. But when it comes to like a climbing wall, if you're climbing with straight arms, you can also cue just like rotate on your rib cage, like get tight through your rib cage. And you can do the same thing with cueing someone for those exercises. And again, it's like a auto correction thing, but the more we can help people not think about the thing on their body, it tends to be higher quality. So having those outside cues tend to make sense. For like, I think something that people get frustrated with when they do lateral raises or when they do external rotation from 90 degrees is the leverage for those muscles isn't very good. And so it's actually pretty hard to progress the intensity of the exercise, where it's very easy to progress overhead press. You're using the pec, you're using the deltoid. Those are both quite large muscles. But when you're doing a standing external rotation, it's hard to get more out of the muscles because they're quite small. And so in that context, I have a lot of people do like a 90, lower it to a horizontal position and hold it for 5 seconds. So you can add time under tension. We should be doing higher reps with accessory work, right? And so if people aren't familiar with doing those things, but they're familiar with doing the heavier things, it's like, well, I'm progressing really good here, but here I'm not progressing at all. And I think that's still okay. It's still worth doing those things, but we just have to find new ways to give them more time under tension, right, to make the muscle adapt. I think that the endurance of the shoulder, especially with external rotation, is way more important than the force output anyways.
Yeah, when it comes to some of these accessory type of exercises versus like the big heavy lifting, I just find that I can stay at a similar weight for a long, long time and just get better and better at focusing. I don't know how to put it, just that mind muscle connection, just really paying attention and getting more endurance. And I don't know if I need to, triple my external rotation with a band for my rotator cuff. Like, I'm not sure, like, would I get way better if I was 3 times as strong as that? Or is that not exactly the right way to think about those kind of exercises?
I mean, you're probably just not going to. Like, those muscles it's not as big. There's not as many type 2 motor units in the muscle groups. Their job is to have endurance, right? As soon as you lose endurance of your shoulder, you die, right? In like an evolutionary setting, right? As soon as you can't locomote, you can't climb a tree, or you can't throw a spear or something, you're toast, right? And so if they were all very phasic muscles, big power, whatnot muscles, you would get tired fast, right? And so I think evolutionarily, it doesn't really make sense that you're just going to get yoked rotator cuff muscles obviously there's lots of variability between people, but like from a climbing standpoint, like the posterior deltoid and the deltoid still does external rotation. There's still more bulk there too. And so it's like, I think having quality movement with the rotator cuff satisfies the need for scapular focus stuff as well as other strength training stuff. But the reason that we do more repetitions, obviously, is because the endurance, really matters.
Okay, you said something about cueing while climbing. Like, we don't want to make people think about like, what is your like scapular position for this move? But that made me think that the cueing that you could do while climbing could be helpful as far as making you move more safely and strongly. Like, can you go back into, you talked about like twisting the rib cage, basically like what is some of the cueing that you might give someone while climbing to make them climb more safely and strongly, especially in some more risky situations?
Well, what made me think of that was the question that you asked about like the initial cues for like straight arm climbing that we initially do for people that are new to climbing.
Yeah.
Right. Is what I was thinking about that. And I was like, oh, it's climb on straight arms. I mean, the focus there obviously is to work on your footwork and work on twisting your body to make sure you're not just pulling with your arms. Right. And so that's what made me think about that is like a way you don't even tell people, because when you teach someone how to climb, you're like, now we're going to control your scapula and make sure that we do inferior angle glide or up to your tilt. It's like, no. You're just going to climb with straight arms. And the goal is to get to the next hold as smoothly as you can. And then you're going to press through your toes, et cetera. Right. Instead of having someone overly stress about their body parts, and overthinking them, the quality of the movement will go down. So we just kind of want to remove as many internal stressors as we can with athletes. Like when I was in graduate school, because of my mechanics, like I have stiff joints, I have short arms, like I have a -3 ape index, and I tend to have like pretty big muscles, right? And so like when we would do like a scapular measurement control in my like graduate level education, there's no way in hell I've ever been able to touch my hands in the middle of my back. Not even close, right? And when I was a student learning that, we'd go through with groups and we'd all do it, and everyone would be like, holy shit, you're probably not going to survive another 10 years because you can't touch your hands behind your back, where other people are like, whoa, totally can do this. But if we did like a follow-up study, be like, cool, how many of you have had shoulder pain in that much time? Like my incidence of shoulder pain is 0, right? And so it's like, but I carried that around with me and being really stressed about that, being like, man, what the hell's wrong with my shoulder? Like, why don't my shoulders function? And it takes like a much bigger perspective of looking at like research papers and learning about all this shit and being like, oh yeah, okay, I don't need to worry about that at all because that's not helping me in any way.
Well, and how many of your classmates could do a one-arm pull-up? Because I know you can bust that. You should have laughed at them and said, go ahead and touch behind your back. I'm over here climbing hard.
Yeah, it's just like, it's interesting. Like that's a hard thing about people, and why like this rehab course that I'm teaching is really going to be about people just like challenging their own bias and challenging what we all learned in school, because there's, schools have an agenda. They have boxes they got to check off with covering certain things, but they're largely not up to date with all the modern things, right? It's just too hard to change all those things. And so the problem is people carry these things out into the world. And if we don't just continually learn and challenge those, it just like gets thrown around way too much, right? And that's really common in the shoulder.
All right. Well, I want to ask you about some of the cues I use on myself and others in relation to climbing movements and see if they're appropriate. Just I want to like share how I've dealt with some of these riskier situations and see if they resonate with you and make sense from a more like biomechanical standpoint. And I brought up this idea of climbing with straight arms, and it's an important drill that they often do with kids. They even used to put like PVC pipes over their elbows. So you'd wear a PVC pipe over their elbows so that they couldn't bend their arms and then have them climb. You want to make sure you only do this on TR, because if you fall, you'll break your wrist and stuff. And they probably don't do that anymore. But
no, I would be really surprised.
Back in my day, they just put PVC pipes there. But I've seen it in some of my buddies who are older too, where they'll be really strong, but then when I watch them climb, they'll often struggle with that twisting or crossing. And I'll see them get into a position and then they'll kind of bend their arm and reach over. And when you do that drill of having PVC pipes on your arm, or just thinking about this, what I kind of do is I kind of imagine, like twisting through, pulling back with my arm, I guess, even though we're not supposed to talk about this, pulling my scapula back or retracting, getting as much as I can through that movement, and then bending my arm, right? Like, so trying to get them to do everything they can with their body before they bend their arm, because if you bend your arm, yes, it gets you somewhere, but it's kind of inefficient. It's a smaller muscle than using your hips and torso and then your scapula to get that range of motion before bending your arm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course. That's great. That's a great exercise for the scapula, right? It's a great exercise for the serratus anterior, for the lower middle trap. Like, it's good, really good at like positional setting, good for, quite frankly, loading the rotator cuff muscles. It's very intentional for the sport. Like, that's great. I don't think there's any problem with that. That would be much more valuable, in my opinion, doing it on a climbing wall than having someone stand in front of me and say, okay, you need to pull down right here, and get really good at pulling down with either a very low or no intensity, or, thinking about it too much when it's not something that they're actually going to be applying, in their sport. So I think those are great.
Yeah. And just to connect it to that idea of not worrying so much about isolating the scapula or worrying about exactly how it moves, I think something that is not talked about even in climbing enough is just, it's like this chain of movements that I just talked about. It might be like a drop knee cross through. It's like you set your hips, that twists your body, that then pulls through with your scapula, then bends your arm. And that coordination is everything when it comes to strength and technique, because they go hand in hand. And so worrying so much about just your scapula would be like missing how the shoulder actually works, because it worked in conjunction with all that, right? Not just, oh, I set my scapula and that's all I should think about.
Yeah. And if you think about how long you've been climbing and the mechanical load you put on your shoulder over these years, it's like there's a massive, repertoire of coordination and fatigue resistance and, all the mechanical, physical things that will happen with loading over the long term. Like, those are really meaningful. And there's even really good arguments now from some researchers, Philip Strife, I believe his name is, what his assumption is, which is pretty enlightening, I think, is like there's a test called the scapular assistance test. You maybe heard of it, where someone like stabilizes and assists the scapula while someone reaches overhead. And originally, like, maybe 15 years ago, it was designed as a means of blaming the scapula for someone's shoulder complaint. If they assisted the scapula and their pain went down, it's the scapula's problem. Now, his group and modern research would say those people have a really high incidence of rotator cuff tears. And so from his perspective, it's like, wow, someone's rotator cuff is getting a lot of stress. Because of that, the scapula has changed its mechanics to try and optimize the rotator cuff. And so the problem with those kinds of exams and that being the focus is, if I've never seen you, I've never looked at your shoulder, and I look at your shoulder and it looks weird, it's like, I don't know what the hell it looked like before it hurt or before you had pain. And if I don't know that, if I don't have that information, like, how meaningful really is that thing? Because the actual diagnostic value of that based on research now is not great. And the actual reliability of measuring it between people is also very poor.
Some ways it'd be nice if it was that simple, where it's like, oh, like it all boils down to just where your scapula is and we can just fix that. But things are much more complex.
Like, if anything was that simple, people wouldn't have pain complaints, right? It would just be check off the box.
Okay. A situation that people encounter that I find risky personally, but I'm sure other people do, are gasstones. And the more extreme they are, in some ways, the more risky. Gastocling is this idea of, instead of it being an undercling, you're so internally rotator. So like, I don't know how to describe it. Gastocling.
Yeah, it's a massive internal rotation and you're extending the shoulder. It's a massively stressful position.
So that doesn't mean you can't do these positions. The shoulder is amazing. But if you get into these extreme ranges of motion, be careful yarding. And one of my cues there, well, actually, I guess the first cue would be like, maybe don't do it over and over and over and over and over again if you're not used to exposing yourself to that range of motion, that stress. But something I think about doing when I get into internal rotation is I try to actually put a little external rotation. You almost kind of like you're pulling it apart, pulling that elbow down, kind of like the opposite of chicken winging. Is that a cue that would be favorable when you encounter extreme gas stones, or really any gas stone in some sense?
Yeah, I think there's definitely more of a passive internal rotation moment to get into the position, but then when you're there, you're definitely twisting down. So you're definitely, going into external rotation. But I would say even if someone is used to that position, doing it over and over and over and over is definitely risky. And that's just the nature of like someone climbing at their absolute max relative to them, whatever that is just the exposure in those really hard positions. The tolerance is just going to be much lower, right? And so the real answer of, I don't ever want to get hurt, I want to be bulletproof forever. It's like the only way you can really do that is to never try hard, right? And never expose yourself to those awkward, weird positions. But I would say even like to build capacity for doing that, you can't just do that to build capacity because the risk is pretty high. But conversely, if I did something like a face pull, it's kind of the same ending position here. I can do a bench press where the load puts my shoulder in extension. I can do like a pull-up isometric where I'm locking off at the top. Like those are, stressors that are easy to track and easy to adjust that are less risky than the really hard position. And that's, I think, the biggest argument for basic strength training and its progression is giving people exposure in those positions that has less risk and it's easier to quantify, than doing it on the climbing wall.
I will tell you, I still do it on the climbing wall sometimes where if like, maybe it's like a really extreme heel hook, I'll just like set it and then get off. Like, you know what I mean? Like you like get into the position.
Oh yeah, that's great.
Just like, hey, by the way, body, what do you think of this? Like maybe I don't dino into it.
That's essentially what limit bouldering is, right? That's what limit bouldering is like finding a position that's ridiculously hard for you and trying that individual move to get coordinated at that exact position, length, tension, speed, etc. So yes, I totally agree with that. And that's actually something I do, quite often with people that have either, post-surgical rehab or that are kind of really fearful and loading from previous history or new mechanism, etc., is doing those positions on a climbing wall, right? And using an adjustable wall where you can go from vertical to 40 degrees. I can have someone very comfortably use 2 gas stones. I can have someone do 2 wide compression holds. I can have someone do an undercling, and then we can just slowly lean back the wall and give them that very intentional, climbing specific exposure. I think the important part there is that's more meaningful to an athlete than is doing a bunch of chin-ups or a bunch of pull-ups or things off the wall, right?
For sure.
So where it comes to like, patient decision-making, it's like, well, what do you want to do? They're always like, I want to rock climb again. And say, so the further I keep them away from that, the less likely they are to feel that the interventions are helping. But if like day one, I'm like, cool, let's go to and I think a lot of people are surprised when I'll communicate like really sore wrist or really sore elbow. They're like, they expect me to tell them to not climb for a week. I say, no, you can definitely go to the gym. We are going to modify and modulate the things you're doing to make them that I know that they're safe and mechanically they feel safe for you. But if I can have you do a lot of those cueing positional things on a climbing wall in a controlled space, like they get back to the wall sooner because they know that's the direction they're headed.
So I want to keep picking on some of these movements and the cueing that I've suggested. And here's the reason why, Tyler, is I think that when I hear something about scapular dyskinesis and, hey guys, you don't need to worry so much about how your scapula moves and it's not the root of all your problems. I think sometimes when people hear that stuff, they feel like it's just a carte blanche, just do whatever you feel like and nothing is wrong and there's any way is okay. But the body does seem to have these movement patterns that lead to strength, like this idea of getting into something passively in internal rotation. But then when you start yarding onto it, kind of emphasizing external rotation, just like if I were to do a pull-up, maybe I don't need to overly focus on pulling my scapula down, but I would imagine that you don't want me to overly focus on pulling my scapula up either. And so I like using these climbing movements to kind of show how your body may do this is probably going to be unique, but that there are some kind of bookends of what makes sense and what doesn't.
I think the pull-up example, a cue that works is like just like you would with a deadlift is and a bench press is you want to like bend the bar. So literally grab and just like twist out, right? And essentially that just brings the elbows a little bit more towards midline, right? That's going to get a lot of posterior shoulder engagement and then, complete the movement. I think doing like I have quite a few of my clients do single arms, scapular pull-ups, primarily because like it's slightly different coordination than doing them with two arms, but two arms tends to be too easy. So you can just like go straight to doing single arm kinds of loads. Like, again, that goes back to what we talked about. Basic education and coaching for strength conditioning stuff already does that. And so if we have like the literature and what people suggest for basic strength conditioning, even for like bench pressing, people will have a bit arch in their back and they'll make sure they're pushing really hard through their feet, make sure they're really, bending the bar. Like just doing that, you can feel the shoulders be more engaged, right? And so it's like, instead of being really microscopic with, hey, it's this exact movement, this exact thing, we can just be more broad and teach people that those movements are checking off that box, for the most part.
That totally makes sense. And I hope that that's what I'm doing is connecting those movement patterns that you kind of get from basic strength and conditioning of bending the bar. And if you think about that, that is external rotation. So even though it's a Gaston and it's a one arm move and you're on a wall, like you're still kind of doing that same thing that makes you stronger and hopefully safer, I would think too, even in those extreme ranges of motion.
I think maybe one of the most talked about, what's a nice way to say this? People use the language for a long time that doing fingerboarding, there's a way to do it. Like you have to do a scapular pull-up to do it safely because it reduces the risk of shoulder injuries. That is terrible. That's bad advice, in my opinion. There's no evidence to support that that's necessary. But when people teach that to coaches and coaches kind of put this on the internet, and now it's like how to do a proper hangboard workout, it's like that totally misses the point of the multifunctional kind of synergy of the scapula with the rest of the body, right? And so it's like there's that kind of stuff is the stuff that I think is less helpful for people because it's just confusing, right? And have you heard that before? I'm assuming. I see that.
I think I have, but it kind of surprises me because if you just think about how we climb, like if you're on a 40-meter sport route, you're not like packed shoulder the whole time. You're relaxing, hanging relaxed. Like I guess the thing that, even though I'm talking about the cueing that I think can help in these certain kinds of movements, like you have to kind of be able to do everything. Like sports typically require you to kind of showcase the complete range of what the scapula does. And I think that like you could only hang from a fingerboard like that. I mean, go try it. You don't have to, you're not going to tear your shoulder off.
People definitely do that. And that kind of like language around the scapula makes people feel like there's like this very, intentional way to do it. But the counter argument to that is like, well, now you're engaging more muscles and you're actually shortening those muscles a little bit. So you're probably getting a little bit less torque at the shoulder from the lat and the pec. And so, it's like, I would people be much more precise and intentional with what their fingers are doing on a fingerboard if they're using a fingerboard than worrying about the scapula. But that's a really good example of a lot of the fear generation that comes with people thinking that loading overhead without your scapula engaged is dangerous, which is absolutely not true.
Yeah, go relax from a bar on one arm. Like your shoulder will, well, unless you have some serious problem, maybe you can't tolerate that load, but you can hang, relax. Look at monkeys.
There's a lot of people that do that. There's a lot of like coaches that will suggest doing like 30-second relaxed hangs to stretch the inferior joint capsule too. And so that's also something that could be pretty helpful for, like I do that for my shoulders all the time because my shoulders are stiff. But the kind of load that I need is literally hanging with one arm for like 30 seconds. Where if I like take that, hey, you all should hang with one arm for 30 seconds, that's bad advice for probably most people. That works for me because I'm so stiff, right? And my muscles tend to get bulky there.
Quick break while I tell you about today's sponsor. Thank you to all the patrons who help make this show possible. Join them so you can get episodes early before anyone else, and those episodes are ad-free. As a patron, you also get to submit questions for upcoming guests. The answers to those questions are only available to patrons. Follow the link in the show notes to join now. You also get access to a private Discord where you'll find me and other people who want to go from good to great. Okay, back to the pod. Okay, I really did want to ask about those hangs. I learned them from Ido Portal. I'm sure he took it from someone else, but just those relaxed hangs, and you see it all over the internet, like, this cured my shoulder from shoulder surgery. And then I was thinking that probably depends on if you're tight or generally loose, and probably just like everything else, it depends on you. But before we go into that and other exercises, I wanted to ask again about a common area where people get injured and the cues that you might suggest to help them approach it safely. And that's dynos. And you just did a great Instagram post on kind of like the demands that dynos place on the shoulder joint. And just, yeah, can we go over that?
Yeah. I mean, dynos are a huge dynamic load, and there's a lot of deceleration that has to happen with a dyno. And, you know, it's one of those examples of you can't really train to be good at dynos without training to do dynos, right? But we can make someone slowly and progressively more tolerant of overhead load like that in a more controlled way, you know, with doing like single arm hangs, like we just mentioned, or rapidly loading single arm hangs, or other like a range of motion specific things, especially the deceleration phase, to build a really strong, robust shoulder for that. You know, but it definitely is a big load to the labrum, definitely a big load to the joint capsule, big load to the rotator cuff muscles, but it's very different in its physiologic like need than is just like doing a dead point or just like a dead reach. You know, overhead is like that dynamic nature of it just makes it quite a bit lowered tolerance, I guess we could say, where I think regardless of the training intervention, you're going to have lowered tolerance for dynamic overhead reaching with a dyno than you will with static reaching for a dyno, obviously. So it's like, that's the thing that I think maybe people forget about. It's like, oh, this move is particularly hard on the shoulder. I probably can't try it as many times as I tried this other project that didn't have a dyno.
The only cue I have, and we'll see what you think, is trying to kind of go past it. Like if you catch it a little bit, I don't want to say like scapular engagement, but you know, like versus completely outstretched at the limits of your range of motion and your shoulder is just reaching as far as it can. I find those more stressful than kind of catching it, you know, with my elbow slightly bent, with my shoulder a little bit bent versus just at the limits of my range of motion. I mean, just anecdotally, that seems safer and more comfortable. Is that true?
I mean, I think so. It all just depends on the dyno though, right? The one that I saw, like the athlete was like full reach. So like if you can, sure, having a bit more muscle engagement prior to catching makes sense. But if it's a full reach and your arm's extended, it's like you have no choice, right? So it definitely depends. But when it comes to like exercises that would really address that position, I love like the straight arm, like row variations, straight arm pull down, like, some people call it like a lat prayer, but it's essentially a straight arm pull down. So essentially with a cable machine, and there's a couple different ways you can do this, but a cable machine, both arms fully overhead, kind of in like a slightly wider than shoulder position, you're essentially just going to pull straight down all the way to like your hips. And so essentially it's like your arms are fully extended overhead and you're creating this extension moment from a fully flexed position. Like that just builds like the lat and the pec very well. And that top end, because the top part's the hardest part, like that's a good example of how people maybe misuse this term specificity. It's like, that doesn't look like rock climbing, but I would argue that looks a lot like catching a dyno. That looks a lot like doing a mantle. Like it's really, you know, a more mechanical precision than it is just like, hey, climbing looks like you only do pull-ups kind of thing.
I mean, if you see some of those videos of athletes, especially like the elite level athletes, catching things at full extension, taking the swing with like, you know, 3-finger drag barely on their tips, like you just gotta understand that these are people who have built up to it for their whole life typically. Like in some ways they've exposed themselves slowly up to that point. And, you know, if you've never experienced that and then you go and you huck yourself at a dyno that puts you at absolute full extension. Yeah. Like it's risky. And so anything you can do to like grade that exposure in the weight room, or just through a decade of climbing. I just don't think people often appreciate that a lot of the elite athletes have 15 years under their belt. Maybe they were so young when they were starting out that their dyno was, smaller and it wasn't as big, and just have slowly built that capacity to take that rip at full extension. And even that, it doesn't make it not a risky position, but the riskier it is, ideally, like the more buildup you've had to experience that risky position. So that's not so risky for you anymore because you have the tissue tolerance, over, literally decades sometimes.
Yeah, always a risk calculation. I tell all my clients, I talked to one this morning with the finger injury, and it's kind of something that's been chronic and kind of come back with climbing, and not really bad where I need to have him suggest stop climbing, but he's going on a trip in a week to Spain. And so it's like, that's a risk calculation. It's like, is it worth the risk? Probably for him, because he's going climbing. He knows he kind of has something lingering. He's not really going to go super hard at his limit, but that's going to be hard to do still. But it's like, that's probably worth the risk to do, to climb in Spain. And then when he gets back, he's really got to pay attention to it, right? And so that's always what it comes down to with injuries, even shoulder injuries. Like if you have kind of a sore shoulder and you're going on a big trip and you're going to fit in a bunch of things, is it likely to be sore still? Yeah, probably. Does that mean structurally that it's worse than it was before? No, probably not. Does it mean that it's going to stick around a little bit longer now? Yeah, of course. And so having that conversation with people is very real and important, instead of putting too much emphasis on exercises. You mentioned when you talk to someone who you read about them saying, oh, hanging straight arm helped fix my shoulder overhead. Exercises don't fix injuries. And so if we look at like the data on, saying, people don't have to get stronger to get better. People don't have to do manual therapy to get better, but some do. And so it's like, we don't really understand the mechanisms other than natural history. Things just get better, right? And regression to the mean, like, just goes back to what it was before, right? And so a lot of the emphasis that I give people is like, it does matter what we do, but in other ways, it doesn't matter what we do, but it matters what you want to do and what you think makes sense, right? And that's like, again, back to like being very comprehensive.
I like that you said that it's this idea of having like bulletproof shoulders or bulletproof fingers. It's like, if it's 100% safe, then it won't work, or you can't progress unless you experience pushing the intensity a little bit past what you've done before. And I do this thing all the time where I'm talking to some kid or some athlete who just did their first, V17 or something, and they are on one, and it's clear that they have like leveled up. I always like encourage them to take a week off. I'm like, you did it. Like, you made it. I know you're feeling great, but like, you're probably stressing yourself at a high level, and maybe just take a little bit of time off. But then the pushback to myself there is like, they have to kind of ride that line if they want to get better. Like, they have to keep pushing, and it doesn't mean you're not going to get injured, but if you don't risk getting injured, then you're not going to get better either. It's this funny thing that when you're an athlete and you're pushing to be better, you have to hang it out there. And so you might get hurt, it might happen.
Yeah, always. Everyone's always riding the line that's pushing themselves. And it's very apparent to healthcare providers, because every person that I talk to with an injury, regardless of its shoulder, finger, elbow, whatever, is the big piece of information for me is like, cool, let's talk about the last couple months of your training. What does it look like? And then for them to be able to see, and a lot of times literally people will say it out loud and be like, oh, but then I started this new thing, and then I really got psyched about this thing. And they're like, oh shit, yeah, I didn't really notice that until I said it out loud. It's like, cool, like that's a big part of having a consultation with someone, is identifying those new things and the quick spike and change of load. And those are the things that are hard for people to really stop to think about, because when you're in the best shape of your life and you're climbing as good as you ever have, all you want to do is do more. And that's totally normal. And every athlete does that, and it's really hard to have someone put the reins on themselves. Like, it's a human problem.
I also got to tell you, that's one of the things I've struggled with, where as I get older, I can't always trust my previous intuition, where I used to kind of be able to trust my psych level. Like, if I really was excited to climb, I should go climbing. And then if I started getting not too psyched, it was maybe a hint that I was maybe my volume was too high and I needed to take a little bit of a rest. But nowadays I have to rethink my intuition and perhaps pull back a little bit, because even though I want to do more, I can't always handle the volume. And I don't know how you can do that as a coach, but I don't know what your advice is to people to understand how to manage that load so that they're writing that line better.
Yeah, it's hard. I just actually posted this morning about something I've thought about for a long time. And like, I'm teaching this course for healthcare providers on how to manage climbing injuries. And it's like, there's a lot of talk about understanding objective load and understanding capacity, and using Tim Gabbett's work with something called the ACWR, which is like essentially a tracking method to understand your weekly load and your monthly load and your macro cycle load, et cetera. So I came up with this climbing load index that hopefully will be able to integrate whole hand move number per session, wall angle, RPE, include also like climbing style, either powerful or less powerful, and then also include hold size as a way to give people arbitrary units to track in their session, so they can get a better sense of what that session really means in relation to their last week's session or their last month's session. So it's, again, one of those like habits that people have to develop, but I mean, it makes sense. And it's one piece of, a larger puzzle of an athlete and their motivations and their sleep and et cetera. But to objectify the external load, it, should be quite helpful for people to maybe have something besides their own sensitivity and their own emotions, to make those decisions.
How much of a factor is something like, oh, I started a new job, or I had a kid, or do you see increases in injuries in climbers when they bring in some other outside stressor?
I mean, outside stress is really hard it might be a correlation there, but it's really hard to, have it be a causal factor, hard causal factor. I think maybe thinking about having a child is like, people know they're having a child, and so they know their life's going to slow down. And so they cram a bunch of stuff in before. That probably makes sense. I think the job is probably less risky and unless it's something totally new and whatnot. But, those factors matter. Like, people's social relationships and their sleep habits and all that stuff is really influential on recovery, But those things are harder to modify. I always tell people the training loads and the tracking what you did on the wall and the tracking what you did with your lifting is really easy. The hard part is understanding how you can sleep better, or how you can remove emotional stress from your life, or have better relationships. Like, I don't have control over that stuff. It's hard for them to have full control over that stuff, right? And so it's, again, always that, oh, this week's particularly hard, let's drop the loads this week. Oh, this week is very low stress, let's increase the loads there. So it has to be kind of a moving, fluid kind of process, which is ridiculously hard for anyone to pin down.
I got bad news for everyone listening. It seems like the older you get, the more stress and things you have to do increases. And the thing that gives is your training volume. It's never like, oh, this is a low stress week with my kid. Like, that doesn't exist. Or even in work, it seems very rare that work somehow the volume of that goes down. It's one of the things that I think is hard about being an athlete as you get older, is recognizing the increases in stress in your life and the demands, and having to scale your training appropriately.
Yeah. And I think even on that topic, I would be much less trained if I didn't have my training facility in my garage. And this is not applicable for everyone around the world, of course. But like, I usually leave to catch the train at 7 and I don't get home till 6 o'clock usually. Like, that's a long day of working, right? Where like, if I want to get something done, I can do it pretty quickly because it's in my house, but I usually only have maybe an hour to do so. And so like this last weekend, we mentioned, like, I had listened to a talk from Andy Galpin, and there's good evidence now, both from him and other researchers, showing that like small spurts of stuff is still good training. A lot of people, especially for rehabilitation, they feel like they need to have this 2-hour block to go to the gym. But like, I came home from my drive on Sunday from Vegas, and I went in my garage and I did 3 exercises for my shoulder. That was like all I did. And so the frequency and the regularity of the loading is really, in a lot of people's, is probably better than having really big, long sessions anyways. I talk to a lot of people that I have a big climbing session, and then I do my accessory things after, or my strength training after. If that's the only way you can do it, sure, that's fine. But it probably makes more sense to have a session where you're having better quality with the training stuff. And it doesn't need to be a lot. A lot of people have gyms at their work or gyms at their apartment. Like literally when you walk by, spend 20 minutes and do your shoulder, strength training stuff. Like it really is effective in that way as well.
Anecdotally, I know that when I was younger, I was just running around all the time, climbing outdoors. So I'm like hiking, just doing lots of stuff all the time. I was always really flexible and I never had to think about mobility or even in some sense, strength training. But then as I've gotten older and instead of having it be kind of like a steady drip of movement where I'm, running around all day, instead now I'm sitting around all day and then trying to cram it all into the gym in an hour or two. It's just not as good as kind of like the steady drip all day, where if you're kind of, even if it's just a little walk in the morning, like, what's better than 0 shoulder exercises? 1 shoulder exercise. It's infinitely better. You don't have to do 10. I really like that, man.
People probably think I'm crazy around this office, this multi-use work building. It's an old industrial building that was revamped, but there's like things like big metal staircases and things to hang on and stuff. And I'm always like just randomly, because I sit for my job a lot talking to people on calls, I'll just go do some hangs or go do some isometrics or go do like some resisted external rotation things against all these apparatuses around here, take my bands out and do stuff. It's like those things they add up, right? And so having a lot of resilience for a lot of different movements is really just about getting it done. Getting it done is way more important than when you get it done, or the actual volume of what you're doing is just like, if the volume's equated per week, it doesn't really matter when you get it in, right? So if people have that kind of time crunch, like that is preventive for injury risk as much as we can say, and that is rehabilitative.
Who had that term of like the greasing the groove training? I can't remember. I heard it from this guy, Dan John, many, many years ago, but I think it was
Kelly Starrett uses that term.
Okay, well, the thing I remember was something along the lines of they were focused on getting people to do pull-ups. And so rather than having them do, 3 sets of 10 pull-ups 3 times a week, they're like, okay, every time you walk by this door frame, wherever, do 1 pull-up. And that the load was much less, but there was an element of coordination, of just learning how to do the movement well and getting that steady drip of volume throughout the week rather than like these very intense blocks, and that they saw better results. And it makes me think about shoulder health, about tissue development, and just, it's like this in climbing where I think sometimes we see in climbing people get into climbing, they're hardcore on bouldering and boards, and they don't do that much movement. And I often encourage people who are new to climbing to start sport climbing, because you just get to climb more and just getting reps. And so, just doubling down on what you're saying, really.
I think when I'm going back to like exercise as the solution is whenever I have someone that, comes to a consultation with me about having a pain complaint, it's always an addition problem. And so everyone looks online, everyone gets advice from a friend, and it always is centered around a particular exercise. But a really important question for people to maybe ask themselves is like, okay, my shoulder is sore. I included this exercise. Did you take something away? Did you modify your climbing volume? Did you modify your power output during your climbing sessions? Exercises don't really address the fundamental habit that maybe created the pain complaint. And they just are making themselves more fatigued, right? And people can't really hear that enough, because what happened to make the shoulder sore maybe was a month of overload or a really big week, right? And if we don't really stop and address that and people don't think about that, adding in new exercises absolutely will not help, right? Regardless of whether they're motor control for the scapula, whether they're the best exercises for the rotator cuff, that's not really going to address that individual's problem. So it's always important for people that maybe have shoulder pain is really sit and write down what your training looked like the last month. What did it look like the last couple months? What changed about that training that maybe created that sensitivity? before you start looking on the internet and get confused with all the exercises to do.
I remember that when I had my second kid, all of a sudden my neck and shoulder on my left side, which I never had problems with, started hurting. And I was like, oh, I've been carrying around a kid a bunch.
Like doing an isometric for 5 hours a day.
Well, I also, and correct me if I'm wrong in this, I would think that also going to the other end of the spectrum is wrong. So don't necessarily add things, but also maybe don't go to zero either. Like it doesn't mean that you have to go to zero, which personally, Tyler, I've actually had problems with this. When I get hurt, I take it personally. I think that like my life is over. Climbing's not for me anymore. I hate everything, and I will just stop and I will do nothing. And I've learned over the course of the years that that seems to also somehow make me in more pain, and I somehow don't recover. And so finding the right dose, and it's definitely not too much. It's definitely not zero.
I think the number that like I included with this new climbing load index is taken from Tim Gabbett. And he has this ACWR that's researched and whatnot. Mine has not, we've not done that yet. Hopefully it gets done, but essentially it's like 20-30% difference in your regular load, either up or down, can be a risk factor. And so, like you said, doing too little, if you're an athlete, it's definitely not going to help connective tissue injuries. It's definitely not going to help build confidence, not for blood flow, et cetera, all these other factors. But that's a good example. You're a good example from my perspective of someone that like has a strength training habit. So like if you're not psyched about climbing or something sore, it's like, cool, take some time off, keep strength training though, right? And if you do, if you keep the shoulders loaded, keep the chest and the back loaded and the legs and the hips and the fingers a little bit, like you'll come right back to climbing and the risk will be much lower than if you just do nothing for a month or so and then come back to climbing, right? Because your total capacity will go down. And so it doesn't always have to be so specific to climbing to keep that capacity. You're not going to forget how to rock climb, but your tissues will have a lower tolerance.
So the way I found this out was actually after I dislocated my shoulder. I told you it took me out for like 6 months or something. And I really did nothing. I really just sat around and did nothing. And it was, I moved back to my farm for the summer. I was in college. I moved back to the farm. I hadn't been climbing. I hadn't been doing anything. And it was harvest season. And I was like carrying around a bunch of boxes of fruit. And then my shoulder was kind of hurting, but started getting better. And I thought about climbing. And I thought to myself, well, you know what? My shoulder hurts all the time. So might as well have it hurt all the time and climb. And sure enough, it got better. I mean, clearly I had some issues over the next 10 years, but I also went from like V9 to V13 in those years. So even with my unstable shoulder, it's, you know, I was still able to progress. I just had that moment where I was like, well, screw it. If it's going to hurt when I'm not climbing, might as well have it hurt while I am climbing. And that's not, I don't want people to take that as a license to say like, my finger hurts, I'm just going to go crimp really hard anyways. But there is some balance there too. I like that, like 20 to 30% up and down is a risk factor. And so, yeah, zero is not good either. So good lesson.
I think that's a perfect example of you feeling when it's ready based on progressive overload with things that are very safe. You know, like with your arm at your side carrying a basket, that's a really stable position for the shoulder. You're not going to hurt it. But if it goes heavy, if the load goes heavy, you're definitely loading the rotator cuff. So it's still a good exercise. And if you're putting it onto a box or a pallet or a truck or something, that also is scapular activation, rotator cuff exercise. So you just did a basic progressive overload program until you were bored with it. And you're like, I feel like I should go rock climbing. And then you did. That makes total sense. That's
what people should take out of this podcast. If you get hurt, go work on a farm. It's really good times.
Work on a farm.
Don't. Farming is not near as romantic as it sounds, you guys. Trust me. I grew up doing it. Lots of manual labor. Okay. I want to ask you about some of the common exercises that I was going to say people do, but maybe it's I do, and just how you feel about it as far as helping out shoulder stability, strength, prehab, rehab, and then ask you if there's any other ones you might recommend. And just because it's too perfect, I like doing farmer's walks, Tyler, where you hold 2 dumbbells and, stand up straight and walk around with them. And I've found it has been good for me. I don't know if I can quantitatively point to something. I'll just say qualitatively, sure feels good. And
you're a farm kid.
It's
necessary, right?
that, yeah.
But in order to do a farmer carry, you have to like quote set your shoulder, right? If you pick a heavy load up, you definitely pull your shoulder down and back. And if the load's heavy, you definitely get a lot of rotator cuff activation. You're not getting any shortening of those muscles, but it's an isometric for the rotator cuff. I think for people that are post-surgical, that's like the first thing I give them to do. Or people that have a really fear-generating thing, you can do a farmer's carry. You can start doing a shrug. It's not really going to change much about that particular movement. But if you're doing like a single arm shrug, you just get also like a little bit of lateral flexion. You get a little bit of core activation. I think that's a great exercise, probably underused in climbers.
Yeah, one of the cues that helped me just feel better in my shoulders, in my rotator cuff. I don't want to overemphasize like how I felt it or where I felt it. I just think it was good all around. Was this idea of that string pulling your head up, that thing that they tell you to do where you feel like you have a string on the top of your head. Because when I was really trying to like pull my shoulders back or do something weird with my shoulders, it felt kind of weird. But then if I just kind of imagine, my neck lengthening a bit, that really felt like it was a good cue for me to stand up tall, and have the load balance versus overly shrugging or retracting my shoulders. So just that was my little cue.
I think that's fine. There is, as maybe a counter to that, is there is some evidence in the strength training world that people can be too over prescriptive. And the argument there is if I sit there and, critique someone with how they're doing a deadlift or they're doing the farmer walk and they try and be so robotic in that movement, it's like, that's not really what it looks like when you get tired. Yeah. Right. And so the one caveat there is like, we can be overly, and this happens a lot with scapular dyskinesis, is people sitting there with inclinometers and measuring it and touching, and that stuff can be okay for people with pain complaints. But essentially it's like it kind of reduces the total movement variability that people have when they do these things, which is protective long-term. And so if they do like a functional MRI scan on someone's brain and they move their shoulder, even though the range of motion is the same, even though it looks the same, the actual neurons that light up are not the same. And so there's like a built-in variability for us to have these different pathways to do things long-term. Not to say that your cue is not good, but just like as a caveat, I think that's cool for people to think about, because you can be overly thoughtful about it. And that has been shown to be less helpful.
That's really good. And I think I'm going to tie it back to also you being your own advocate or a patient, where what I like is getting different cues from different coaches, trying different things out, and then doing it over and over again and settling into kind of my way, and maybe it doesn't look exactly like how you do farmers walks, but like, that's okay. That's okay. Okay. Here's a classic one. Pull-ups. Do you have any special ways or cues for people that do them? I mean, people used to ask me all the time, Josh, how I get better at climbing. This is not because of the podcast. It's just, gyms and stuff like that. Just people would come up to me and ask for tips because they thought I was, had some secret. And one of my biggest things was, can you do a pull-up? Can you do 10 pull-ups? Like, we're climbers. Can you do some pull-ups? Like, yes, you need to use your feet. Yes, we have a lot of technique, but if you just asked me, I need to get stronger for climbing, I'd be like, can you do a pull-up? And surprisingly enough, a lot of people can't. But is there anything around pull-ups that you think are important or protective, or just pull-ups, Tyler, are staple? Any thoughts?
I have no gripes with pull-ups. Essentially, like I think I probably maybe am a bit biased in my demographic. Again, with the people that I work with, don't think I've ever, maybe a few people that I've talked to that actually can do a bunch of pull-ups. A lot of my clients are definitely well-trained athletes that are very strong, and they need to do less pull-ups because they do so much overhead activity. But pull-ups as a strength training exercise, basic, great, no gripes with the exercise. There's a whole bunch of variations that people can do if they had a shoulder complaint where you could modify a pull-up. So maybe we could take it that way, where if someone had pain in the starting position of the pull-up, we can just have them start at 120 at the elbow. We could have them do an isometric at 90 degrees. We could change the pull-up to a horizontal rowing position. So if we think about pull up from like a protective strength training thing, yes, pull ups are great. Is a vertical pull up the only way you can train pull strength that's going to transfer to rock climbing? No, of course not. There's a lot of other variations you can do, and we probably don't have time to talk about those. But I think pull ups are, I think the cue essentially is like, I like bending the bar. The elbow's a little bit more rotated and, with external rotation at the shoulder, and you're going to get the lats engaged. I don't love the idea of doing kipping pull-ups for climbers. I usually have climbers do a full dead hang. So it's like 1 to 2 second dead hang. And then like, even with heavy loads, pulling up as quickly as you can, there's good evidence to say that that's better than just like intentionally doing a slow pull-up. So regardless of the load, doing it as fast as you can will be more actionable for rock climbing, which a lot of people will want to do like a really slow eccentric pull-up. And we've talked about that in different contexts on other podcasts here with the fingers, but it's really obvious with the pull-up that pulling, like lowering down is easy when you do your 1 rep max, right? But pulling up is hard. And so being very intentional with the concentric part, I think, is probably the most important thing for climbers.
All right. Bend the bar, definitely. Anything on scapular pull-ups? Maybe you can define them, because I feel like those have had a moment. And, just considering what we're talking about with scapulas and, scapular dyskinesis and shoulder stability and not getting injured. What's your thoughts on scapular pull-ups? Maybe you could define them super quickly too.
Scapular pull-ups are fine. Like I think we mentioned earlier that I'll do them with one arm at a time, because my shoulders are very stiff and the intensity. But doing scapular pull-ups is essentially like you're essentially doing a start of a pull-up movement, but instead of engaging as much with the lat and the elbow, you're just retracting both scapulas down and in towards each other. So essentially you're elevating the chest in relation, but the scapula is pulling down. I think those are totally fine, but that's not like a primary strength training movement. So I would say if people are trying to get scapular pull engagement before climbing, cool, do that. If you're using a fingerboard, do a couple scapular pull-ups on the fingerboard while you're training your fingers. Like those accessory things I think are totally fine to incorporate, but they're not big multi-joint, multi-segmental strength training interventions. And they certainly are not going to change the static position of someone's scapula. And so that's the real thing there is like, if you want to do them, great. That's just training for your shoulder blade. Cool. But it's not going to do anything in terms of making the scapula look different, how it sits on the body.
To link that back to that kind of drill we talked about with the straight arms, when someone does a pull-up, I know you kind of said it's the scapular pull-up is the beginning of a pull-up. Is that how you would encourage people to think about pull-up, is starting it with those straight arms? You're in a dead hang, you're maybe relaxed, you're pulling your scapula down, bending the bar, and then bending the arms. Is that kind of like the sequence that one should think about?
I think most people do that. But if you watch people do a pull-up, they don't really pull vertically down. They tip back a little bit. Yep. Because the first muscle that's activated is the pec major. So when your arm's straight overhead and you go into flexion, if you feel the pec, like the pec is engaged. And so that's why when people go heavy, they don't go vertical. They tip back a little bit because the pec gets engaged and then the elbow flexors kick in. But again, it's like, if we had to pick between doing a scapular pull-up or you doing your drill on the climbing wall, if you're trying to get motor control, I would choose the wall drill any day than off the wall.
Cool. And thanks for linking it to that. I've used that cueing for people who don't understand that kind of drill on the wall of like twisting or using their kind of back before bending their arms, and talked about in that pull-up context where I'm like, okay, like let's do a pull-up, like be really, really relaxed. Like what goes first? Like you're not bending your elbows first. That'd be really hard to do. So yeah. All right. Definitely went down the pull-up rabbit hole, but I kind of wanted to, even though it didn't seem totally appropriate, because it's just so foundational, man. It's not farmer's walks. It's like a very basic kind of movement that we all do. What about those YTWL drill that we talked about? Is that something that you actually encourage, or is that only for people who are injured? You want to describe those two, if in case people don't know that exercise off the top of their head?
I mean, people should think about those as just really good rotator cuff exercises. They have been identified and kind of, with EMG research have been purported as like these scapular control exercises, but it's much more reasonable to think of them as just like good rotator cuff exercises. So essentially the IYTW thing is essentially just doing, retraction, arms to the side or arms behind you with your arms in different elbow angles. So like if you had a dumbbell and you lift your arm straight to the side, that's a T. If you bring your arm a little bit forward in the scapular plane, that's a Y. If you bring them straight in front of you, that's going to make an I. And if you're laying on a bench or you're prone and your hands are making a W, that's going to be a W, right? So I think those are fine exercises. Those are just, if we think about it, they're just ways to put a load in your hand, and we make the lever arm long by extending the elbow, and we stress the shoulder from different positions. But that's all it is. Essentially, it's like I'm loading my shoulder here. I'm getting the shoulder from, this like kind of neutral position here. If I'm doing it with my thumbs up, and then I change more in a scapular plane. So essentially it's just like training the rotator cuff from different directions, which is totally normal and makes sense. But the thing that doesn't make sense is expecting training those things to prevent injury risk, or training those things, making the assumption that they're going to make big mechanical changes to someone's shoulder, because that's where, in my opinion, it kind of gets frustrating for people. Because when I think someone mentioned prehab, I think you maybe mentioned it earlier, is like, I don't really like that term, because essentially what that means now is you're preventing an injury from happening, and exercises don't do that. And we don't have any evidence to say that that actually works. And it's been tried, but the actual number of athletes that have the reductive benefit is not that great, And so it's kind of misleading for climbers to assume they have to do these things every time before, when maybe the general habit is, yeah, sure, that makes sense. But every single time, no, you're still going to get hurt if you try as hard as you want, as much as you want.
Yeah. When I think about these things, and I'm going to use the word prehab just because I did before, what they've done for me is it's typically after an injury, I have rehab exercises that have helped me get back to sport. And I often keep some of them around because they feel good in the sense of they just scratch an itch that I had before, maybe warm me up in a way. But yeah, I want to ask again then. So does that mean that, like, if someone were to try those YTWLs and just are atrocious at them, just like, to be honest, I don't even use them with weight either. I use them without weight and kind of higher rep. And I don't do them all the time, but there was a time where I used them often. But if someone's atrocious at them, does that suggest anything, or like, is it a diagnostic for you, or, when is it appropriate?
It's probably just a coordination thing, because I'm sure with you on a wall, at the grades you're climbing, if you're grabbing onto two side poles and you're pulling in like this, you're doing a W.
Yeah, definitely.
Right. But if I have you lay on a physio ball and you're doing this, you're like, God, that's so hard. I can't do that. It's like, you're just not coordinated at that particular exercise. And so but it is very much the same thing. Right. And so it's like, it's hard to know how much additional training someone needs, because with the climbing, if we watch people climb, they're getting a lot of those stressors. But if we test them off the wall in a very controlled environment, like, ooh, you're not good at that thing. It's like, I don't know. I don't know if I really put a lot of credibility in that with someone. If they have a pain complaint, yeah, we can modify these things. But given all the things that you do and how hard you can climb, is like, you're getting those stressors all the time. I'm not that worried about how much load you can do on a physio ball in the W position, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. And it's also why I think, for me, when I do those kind of things, I'm not interested in the load. And I often do think about it as a more warm up. It lights up my back and scapula and all sorts of things. And I don't use a load, but definitely.
There's nothing wrong. That's just like doing yoga or doing Tai Chi, right? It's just like general body awareness. I think that stuff is totally fine. But for people to assume that it's like preventive is the thing that, yeah, we need to draw the line, right? Because there's no evidence for that. So for people to say that, it's just like, you talk to a lot of different people. You have a much more well-rounded understanding of what people are doing for climbing, and talk to rehab specialists and coaches, right? But just the average climber that goes to the gym and comes home, they don't have that breadth of knowledge. So if they hear, ooh, I'm going to do this to prevent injury, but they don't actually look at the total climbing load, because that's the risk factor, because they're checking off the rehab box, like, that doesn't help that person.
That makes sense. And I agree. I do think it's funny how people just think, oh, because I did some exercise. And also I got pointed out a lot of times when people do exercise, they kind of half-ass them. Like they're doing things. It may look like they're doing, banded external rotations, but they're talking to someone. I found that just because it's a low load doesn't mean you can't really get a lot out of it, but it takes a lot of focus. And I feel like a lot of people do whatever and just
quality is a big deal, right? And exercise quality is hard to assess, which is also maybe why doing your strength training or doing the accessory stuff after they climb is like, that's probably not the best time to do it. It can be done, sure, but it's not very quality. And so if we really care about qualitative movement, like do that before climbing, or do that on a non-climbing day, or find a time to do that when your movement's going to be more what you're looking to get out of it.
Okay, so I threw out a couple of the exercises that people typically think of as being preventative, but you kind of showed why the data doesn't show that you can just check these boxes and be bulletproof. What do you recommend for climbers to try to have shoulders that are as strong, as stable as possible? With the acknowledgement that if we push things to 105% intensity, there's always risk. Maybe it's just this basic strength training that you're talking about, but let's still cover it.
Yeah, I think there's quite a few people that would suggest that basic compound movements are adequate and enough, and then the exposure and variations of those is a function of whether the athlete's bored, when they plateaued, simply doing a change for the sake of change. And so something pulling, obviously, something pressing. I like both horizontal and vertical. For pulling, I like both vertical and horizontal. And then something whole body, right? So people like deadlifts. Deadlifts could be substituted. Barbell, hex bar. You could do your farmer walk. You could use a kettlebell. Like, I think all those are great variations regarding the shoulder. And then I would do accessory things, which is going to be standing, like external rotation. So I do mine standing because my garage is dirty and I don't want to get on the floor. So essentially, which is actually pretty sick. Like, people, minds have been blown. When I was just like standing in my gym one day and I have my loading pin, right, that you do block lifts with, but I never use it because I have cable stacks. But the hole in my squat rack is the same size. I was like, put it in. I was like, oh, that's amazing. So essentially you can do a standing, because people will do like external rotation with their elbow on their knee, but I can just put it in my loading pin so I can keep that as a cue here. And then I'll do rotations here. So I'll do external rotation. I'll use my cable machine to do posterior deltoid flies. So, and people can do this sideline. So if you're laying on your left side, let's say on a bench, and you have a weight in your hand and your arm is straight and you're bringing the load across your chest, and then you're bringing the load back out with your thumb kind of facing the floor. I do mine standing with a cable machine. So arm out here and then pull across, which I like better, again, so I don't have to, lay on my bench, but also it gets more core engagement when I bring it across. Those exercises I like. And then I do all my finger training overhead. So I'll use a rolling thunder, on level edge, tension block, etc. And I'll train my fingers lowering single arm on the cable stack as well, which is a really good shoulder exercise. I actually really like the engagement that you get with the rolling thunder if you go heavy with it. Have you ever used the rolling thunder?
I have, yeah.
So if you don't squeeze it underneath and you put your arm over the top, like in order to like get heavy going down, like you have to like flex into it almost. It makes that movement like really like chest focused, like very heavy on the front side. I do that. And then I've lately been doing straight arm rows, which I'm a huge fan of, just like that we talked about already. And those are the primary things that I would do for my shoulder.
Okay. So kind of the most basic strength training that is just classic. I mean, the push, pull, lower body, upper body, horizontal, vertical. But then I wanted to hear about that kind of accessory work. And yeah, I do all of my rotator cuff or external rotation standing. I don't know. I like that kind of that 90-90 position with a band. I don't always have something here on the elbow to kind of give that cue, but I don't know. I always found it really weird, the either lying or on your knee. I like doing things standing.
I guess was not very complete. Sorry, my brain's getting a little tired. But like for my, let's say my compound day, I will do like a bench press supersetted with a hamstring curl, supersetted with a straight arm pull down, supersetted with a calf raise. So I'll just like it's like amazing. I can just do all those things like one after another, and then I can just like keep doing that. And so that's like a primary heavy lifting day. And then maybe I'll do front levers after that, just because my lats are really warmed up. But on the accessory day, my superset is shoulder shrug. So I do shoulder shrugs all the time with a barbell. And then I'll do like a seated calf raise with my knee extension machine. And then I'll do external rotation standing. And then I'll do something, I have it written down, something for my legs. And then I'll do a Y. So I'll also alternate between the standing Y variation or a lateral raise. So it kind of like checks off that box too. And that's typically, and then the posterior delt fly I'll do on the first day. So I can't remember off the top of my head, but like all those things I just will do like, twice a week as supersets.
I got to tell you, Tyler, I definitely do not do a full strength training program with all that stuff. It's so hard to fit in. And I focus more on the shoulder accessory stuff because of my history of issues. I think that we all know that we should all be strength training, especially as you get older. Like there's, just all the data suggests that regular exposure to weights and doing all those movement patterns is good. My question for you is, how come you have climbers who are pro climbers who never do anything and they have no shoulder issues and they have no finger issues? Is it just total genetics? You see guys like, I don't know, I won't name names, but everyone can think of someone off the top of their head that has never touched a weight and then they never get injured. They seem perfectly muscular in all areas and just like make me feel better about myself and how I have to do all these accessories, but we know people who don't.
I mean, I don't think a good explanation other than just huge genetic variability between people. Just not any good other way to explain it. Obviously, rock climbing is a whole body integrative kind of movement, and people get strong naturally by climbing. But the opposite is also true, right? There's professional climbers that are really skinny and also climb really high grades and also have lots of injury risk too. And so it's like that also have never done strength training. So it's like, I think using professional athletes as an example always is maybe less helpful for people than it's assumed because I always use LeBron James as an example. That dude played professional basketball when he was a little kid. Like, was his coach like the best strength and conditioning coach? Like, no, it's likely that he grew up somewhere where they were doing what they did with every other athlete, but then this like golden goose just pops up out of the world and you're like, damn, that guy's just got all the things right. And so I think there's a huge factor, there, not to discredit those people and their hard work, whatnot. Obviously that's the case, but like, I don't think there's a good explanation other than there's a big genetic variability.
Yeah, it always bums me out how the way sports seem to work is that everyone just gets thrown into the pit and then, the genetic freaks just kind of make it out. It doesn't mean that you can't be just as good a climber, but you can't do what Daniel Woods does and expect to end up like Daniel Woods. You're your own unique body. And when you said that climbing is a full body integrative sport, that's why I always wonder if like people who have been doing it their whole lives and maybe they have an anatomical morphology that leads to them getting really equal stresses in all ways. And they've, climbed on all angles and really steep. They just are kind of checking all the boxes and have done it systematically in, nice little dosings all the way up. And that, that may not necessarily be you. If you started at 20 and you have a background in tennis and then you're trying to climb V10, you didn't get that. Okay. On to some of the Patreon and bonus questions. If you want to hear that Q&A and other extra behind-the-scenes content from this episode and others, head over to patreon.com/testpiece to sign up now. Patrons also get their episodes early and ad-free. There's hours and hours of bonus content there to help you on your own path of going from good to great. Still not sure? There's a free 7-day trial for you to check it out. And to help the show grow, please share this episode with someone who would love it. Okay, see you next week.